In all of ancient literature, one of the best known stories is the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And Eden is a wonderful, peaceful place. Everything is great. And Adam and Eve have been given charge of the garden. They're supposed to take care of the garden. And they can eat fruit from any tree in the garden except for one. And of course, as time goes, they eat fruit from that one tree, and then things go badly for them. And there's a lot going on in this story in the book of Genesis, the first book of the Old Testament. But one of the messages seems to be that there's something about human beings that you can put them in the middle of paradise where everything is great. And there's something about them where they'll still mess it up, right? The story seems to say something about human nature, and it's not necessarily a pleasant message, but perhaps it's a true message. If you travel around the world and you observe different societies, it really is amazing how human beings create communities that are so different. And these are images that we've seen before in earlier discussions, but the photographs were taken just 1 or 2 days apart. The photograph above is of a sort of a water canal that goes through a neighborhood. People live in this area, and you can see all of the trash that is collected in that canal. The photo below is of an alleyway, and as I walked past this alley, I just couldn't help but notice how spotless it was, not the smallest piece of trash. It's really a striking difference. And these two photographs taken in two different countries, but in the same region of the world. So we're not talking about flying, from one place to another place on the other side of the globe, but two countries that are pretty close, and yet they're organized in such different ways. And these photographs tell us something about human nature, what human beings are capable of, because of course both photographs are the result of things that people did. And the things that people do spring from ideas and thoughts that people have. We see things like this in different places around the globe. If we go back to this photo, someone might say, well, the photo above, that points to a culture that's poor. That points to a country that's poor. And the poverty explains the image. And it's true that that country is poor, but actually it's not true because, as I think we've said in previous discussions, the country actually, in terms of natural resources, is a very wealthy country. Actually, it's a very wealthy country that is a poor country. Whereas the photo below, someone would say, well, that photo below, the cleanliness points to a country that's very rich, which is true. It is a very rich country. But actually, in terms of natural resources, it's a very poor country. And so the country below is poor and yet rich. The country above is rich and yet poor. So something interesting is going on, and we see things like this in other parts of the world. The photograph above comes from Japan, a very wealthy, well-organized, prosperous, healthy society. And yet, in terms of natural resources, Japan is very poor. Japan is a resource-poor country in terms of natural resources. And yet, it's a very wealthy, prosperous, secure, orderly, healthy society. The photo below comes from Venezuela, which is a very rich country. Venezuela has, I think, the greatest reserves of oil in the world. Venezuela has many, many, many natural resources. It's a very rich country. Venezuela could be a very wealthy and prosperous country, but it's not. It's desperately poor. It's disorderly. It's dangerous. It's insecure. So how does this make sense? How do you have a country that's resource poor and yet rich and orderly, another country that's resource rich and yet poor, chaotic, and dangerous? All of this springs from things people do. And what people do springs from ideas that people have. Ideas have consequences. Ideas lead to actions, and actions have results. Actions lead to things that we can see in the real world. And these photographs here remind us of this fact, because none of this is accidental. All of this reflects human action. All of this reflects things people did and what people do reflects ideas that they have. So let's turn back to ancient Greece. And you can see Greece there in the box. And we're focusing especially on Athens and what we're calling classical Athens. Athens at this moment in history when we look back and see a place that's really impressive, right? And classical Athens, we think of it as very impressive because some of the people that we associate with it. Socrates, one of our great model teachers, his star student Plato, Plato's star student Aristotle. Another great name from classical Athens is Sophocles, and there are others. But there was something about classical Athens that produced an unusual amount of excellence that continues to influence us to this day. Now we have to say, by our standards, classical Athens I think would be terrible because slaves were everywhere, women had no involvement in public affairs, and so by our standards, classical Athens I think would be terrible. But by the standards of the ancient world, there's something really impressive about classical Athens, and so it's always important to make these distinctions. When we think about classical Athens, when we think about ancient Greece, we can see their legacy in our world to this day, and we've mentioned this before, but it's worth repeating. Scientific thinking, the scientific method, the particular way of thinking that goes into science, we see that for the first time in ancient Greece, in classical Athens. The idea of literature as art, right? Intentionally setting out to write artistic literature. I think we see this among the ancient Hebrews, Psalm 23, for example, Isaiah chapter 40, for example. But we see, I think, much more of this in a much more intentional way in classical Greece, in classical Athens. Drama, the plays of Sophocles, for example. History, as we think of it. Of course, other ancient peoples have historical writing, but history as we think of it, as sort of fact-based, in investigative work, investigating history, the same way a journalist investigates, why did a fire start and what happened, and then writes an article about it in the newspaper. This is what historians do just about things happening further back in the past. We see that kind of thing for the first time among the Greeks. Humanism that is a focus on human beings, asking questions about people. And not just asking questions about people, but because of course other cultures do that, but in kind of a systematic way, reflecting on human psychology, reflecting on the human mind, reflecting on the human spirit. So I use that word human, so this emphasis on people. Logic, systematic logical thinking. We see this among the Greeks. Systematic philosophy that's related to that. And of course we see this in Plato, we see this in Aristotle. Political theory, of course, thinking about politics shows up in different ways in other ancient literature. But again, we're focusing on sort of systematic thinking, step-by-step thinking. We see this in Plato, we see this in Aristotle. And the beginning of democracy, that is spreading power among a lot of people. We see this for the first time among the classical Greeks. We're going to focus on Athens, and we're going to focus on a statement about Athens by Pericles. And Pericles gives a famous speech, what's called the funeral oration, and he does this after the first battles of the Peloponnesian War. And so he's speaking about those Athenians who have died in this war. But as he's speaking about them, he speaks about Athens itself. And one of the things he says is that one of the things that makes Athens great is that Athens has a democracy. Power is in the hands of the whole people. Now we need to be careful because we recognize that by our standards, Athens doesn't look very democratic. Slaves are all over the place. Women are not involved. And so we've got to remember that by our standards, it doesn't look very democratic. By the standards of the day, though, it does look pretty democratic because you don't have any other society where the number of people involved in public decision-making are involved. In Athens, you have more people involved in decision-making about how the community should work than is true elsewhere. The Greek word there is demos, right? And so democracy is a place where the demos has some say, and the demos refers to the inhabitants of an area, ordinary common people, free citizens, right? So this is where this word democracy comes from. And the underlying idea here is that a society works better if decision-making power is dispersed among a number of people rather than one person, for example, a king, or rather than a very small number of people, what we would call an oligarchy. That society works best when decision-making power is dispersed among people. So that's an idea, and that's an idea that's put into effect. And of course, it's put into a greater effect now, for example, in present-day Canada, where democracy is much deeper and much broader. Women vote, young people vote, there's no slavery, right? So we're looking at the beginning of democracy here. This is one of the ideas that Pericles speaks about when he speaks about the greatness of Athens. He says that in Athens, everyone is equal before the law. Again, of course, remembering that we're not talking about the slaves, and so it's a much more restricted idea. When he says everyone, it's a much more restricted idea than the one we have. But here's the idea, that no person should be above the law. So in other societies, you have the law for all of us normal people, but then there's the king who's above the law, right? There are the powerful few who are above the law. The ideal in Athens is that the law is the highest thing, and everyone is subject to the law. And the law is what we agree it should be. So we make decisions about what the law is, at least in some of the laws. Like, I mean, obviously you don't have cars in classical Athens, but the law, how fast should we be able to drive through town? That's a law that we agree to. And then all of us are held accountable to that law. So this is an idea that's at work in classical Athens. Pericles says that what counts in Athens is not membership of a particular class, whether you're born wealthy, whether you're born poor, but the actual ability which a man possesses. And it's classical Athens, so he does mean a man, but for us, it's this idea, we can think of this idea more broadly. So the ability that a person possesses, and here's what Pericles is talking about, is a meritocracy, that advancement is based on merit. Advancement is based on ability, right? And so the photo below, there are a very small number of people who ever get to become professional football players, right? And then among the professional football players, there's a very small number of them who are recognized as the greatest of the professional football players. So the idea is that even if you're born into poor circumstances, you can work hard, you can build certain characteristics, you can be a person of integrity, you can be disciplined, and you can rise out of those situations, and you can be recognized as a person of merit, and you can be rewarded for that. Another idea is that the law commands our respect. Now below we have an image from Mesopotamia, Hammurabi. We've talked about the law of Hammurabi in a previous discussion. And some of these laws seem a bit harsh to us. For example, if you're a home builder and you build a home and then that home collapses and kills somebody, and then you yourself will be killed, that's a pretty harsh law. But we understand we understand what's behind that law, and that's the idea that, look, if you're building someone's home, you should do as good a job as you can. And if these are laws that we've agreed to, which of course is not the case in ancient Mesopotamia. In ancient Mesopotamia, Hammurabi and the other kings, the other Mesopotamian kings, are not consulting a lot of people. They're certainly not consulting, sort of ordinary non-slave men in town about what the laws should be. They're determining for themselves what the laws should be. In Athens, we're determining, there are more people who are involved in determining what the laws should be. And we respect these laws, which seems to say that we respect these laws because these laws are respectable. Right. It's a tough thing if you live in a society where people don't respect the laws because they don't think the laws are respectable. But here we've put laws together that we think are respectable. These laws make sense. We've had our debates, we've had our deliberations. These are what the laws are, and we respect them. And then Pericles says, and then there are the unwritten laws, which we acknowledge is a shame to break, these unwritten laws. And I think what he's referring to is what we've discussed a number of times before, and that is the laws that emanate from, the laws that come from the logos, this reason, this logic, this order that's built into the universe, right? And one part of that logos is moral law. And so there's some things that may not be entrenched in law, in written law, but they're still part of the moral law. For example, it may not be illegal to gossip about other people. So if someone overhears me gossiping about someone, that doesn't mean I'll go to jail, because gossiping about someone is not illegal, right? But gossiping about someone does breach the moral law. It does breach the moral law that emanates from, that comes from the logos. And here in classical Athens, Pericles is saying we do both. We obey the written law and we obey the moral law. Now, of course, he's speaking in idealistic terms. Not everyone does this, right? It can't be a perfect society. We are talking about human beings after all. So it can't be a perfect society. But on the whole, people abide by the moral law. People abide by the written law. We do not say that a man who takes no interest in politics is a man who minds his own business. We say he has no business here at all. If you want to be like that guy down below, with a message on his hand saying, I don't care, well, don't live in Athens. Athens is not the place for you. Athens is the place of participation. Again, understanding slaves not included, women not included, so by our standards, very restricted. But compared to other societies of the world, there's a greater percentage of people involved in decision making. And this is a place where we want people to be involved in public affairs. And when Pericles refers to politics, I don't think he's thinking of politics specifically or only in the sense of what we see on the news. But matters concerning what the Greeks called the polis, the city. Things that have to do with the well-being of the polis, things that have to do with the well-being of the city. We want to be involved in discussions about the well-being of the city. If you don't want to be involved in discussions about the well-being of the city, Athens isn't the place for you. This is a participation society, right? Pericles says here in Athens, we are capable of taking risks and of estimating them beforehand. In other words, we're doing cost-benefit analysis. We're thinking ahead, planning ahead. What are the challenges that might come our way? All right, thinking ahead, planning ahead. All this is very, very important stuff. Pericles says future ages will wonder at us as the present age wonders at us now. And this is true. Just the book down below is a lengthy book that sort of walks through history and shows how the thinking of Aristotle and the thinking of Plato, how the very different thoughts of Aristotle and Plato, how they work themselves out in different ways through history. Sort of the focus of the book is the enduring influence of ideas that come to us from classical Athens. And it's true, classical Athens, for all of its problems, still looks very impressive by historical standards. And so remember that Pericles says that, if you don't want to be involved in the public affairs of this society, then, kind of saying we don't want you here, right? We want people who want to be involved in the public affairs of this society. Now, one of the things we have to notice is that a few generations later, a few generations after Pericles, there's a prominent thinker named Epicurus, and he has a very different view. Notice what he says: we must release ourselves from the prison of affairs and politics. Now look at the difference. Pericles says, we don't say that a man who takes no interest in politics is a man who minds his own business. We say he has no business here at all. This is a participation society. But something has happened within a few generations, so that a prominent philosopher now is saying the opposite. I don't think Epicurus is saying have no interest whatsoever in public affairs. But it seems like a pretty clear statement. We must release ourselves from the prison of affairs and politics. Don't be involved. Something has happened. Something has happened. And so let's put these two quotes side by side. What causes a person to say, you know what, I'm going to wash my hands of politics? That is, I'm going to wash my hands of concern about what's going on in the public life of this community. Right? Pericles is calling for involvement. He's saying one of the things that makes Athens great is the amount of involvement among the citizens of this community. Right? We get a few generations down the road, Epicurus is washing his hands of that involvement. So something happened. Between Pericles and Epicurus, something happened. Something changed. And so we're going to discuss that a little bit more as we go. What can cause this kind of transition, where you have a statement like, like the statement we have from Pericles about the importance of involvement. We move a few generations down the road, and now Epicurus is washing his hands of that kind of involvement. What causes people to say, you know what, I don't want to be involved. I give up on public life. I give up on politics. I don't want to be involved. What could account for that transition? And so we have the question below to kind of think about this kind of thing in our own circumstances. Which outlook seems strongest where you live? When you look around the world you're in, does it seem more like a Pericles kind of reality where people are involved in the community? They're involved in the welfare of the public life of the community? Or does it seem more like a place where people have kind of washed their hands of that? It's more of an Epicurean place where people say, you know what, I don't want to be involved in public affairs. I don't want to be involved in politics. Again, not so much, the stuff that's in the news, although that's part of politics, but here we're thinking about just sort of the running of a society, the well-being of a society's public life. Which of these outlooks seems strongest where you live? And then which of these do you find the more attractive yourself? Do you find this idea of being very involved in what's going on in your society, in your community? Do you find that more attractive? Or do you find the other idea more attractive of kind of, you know what, I just want to mind my own business and not really be involved? Which of those ideas do you find most attractive, and why?